Hello, hello, and good morning. Matthias, I think everybody is in the room, right? Yeah. So good morning from my side. I'm Daniela Klaus from the Presseclub Concordia. We are here in the center of Central Europe in Vienna at the Press Club. But today we will talk about a topic actually that to me is pretty far away. We are talking about the Arctic. And yet what happens there affects us all. And this series of talks, which are a cooperation project by Presseclub Concordia, Forum for Journalism and Media, Vienna, and the Institute for Human Sciences, Europe's Futures, Ideas for Action, and funded by the Erste Foundation here in Austria. This series of talks is about understanding the world around us and understanding the context of what is happening. And the Arctic is very important in this time because it's an important issue. The struggle in the Arctic is strongly connected with the war in Ukraine. So I'm very happy that we have one of the experts in Arctic affairs as a guest today, Martin Breum, who will be introduced by Mirjana shortly. So good morning to everybody. Good morning to Martin. Good morning to Mirjana Tomić, who all of you know, who is curating this series of talks and who is my personal coach in, in explaining what's going on in the world. And so I say hi and I hand the word over to Ivan Vejvoda, who all of you know too, who is the head of the Europe's Futures program at the Institute for Human Sciences. Ivan.
Thank you very much, Daniela. It's great to be here again on behalf of the Institute for Human Sciences and the Europe's Futures program that I lead, and the cooperation that Daniela mentioned that we have with fjum, with Mirjana Tomić, and Presseclub Concordia, I think, has proven its validity and its worth. And so I'm very glad that we have Martin Breum with us today. And as Daniela said, Mirjana, who curates this program, has really done a terrific job and continues to do so. Mirjana, handing over to you.
Thank you very much, Daniela. Thank you very much, Ivan. And before I say just a few words, Martin, are you Breum or Breum? I was going to say Breum.
Well, I think all of you did a nice job. It's Breum in Danish, but it's actually it's a German origin. So
okay,
I'm happy with your pronunciation. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, just a few words. Good morning to everybody, and thank you so much for joining this important, but I would say to an extent underreported topic in this part of Europe. As I was preparing the event, I realized there was lots of media information out there, but somehow we seem unaware of the importance of this region. It is geographically too far. We are lucky to have one of the best connoisseurs of the region, Martin Breum. He's a Danish journalist and has been dedicated the last 12 years of his professional life to the Arctic. He has been writing for the media in Denmark, Greenland, the Faroe Islands, Norway, and Arctic.Today.com in the US. Martin has traveled extensively in the Arctic, including the Russian Arctic, Svalbard, Greenland, and the Arctic Ocean North Pole. He has written 5 books on Arctic affairs and done several television documentaries. He is a former television anchor for the Danish Broadcasting Corporation and former deputy director of international media support, assisting media in conflict zones. The objective of today's talk is to acquire an overall picture of the multi-level consequences of the war in Ukraine, that the war in Ukraine has had on the region: environment, security, climate. For those unfamiliar with the geography and the map, we shall be showing maps of the region so you understand what we are talking about. This morning, I discovered an article, an opinion article that The Guardian published yesterday. It was written by the Labour MP Barry Gardiner. I will just quote the article because it does an excellent introduction to our event. I quote, as Britain's foreign secretary, ask Britain's foreign secretary which part of the world poses the biggest foreign policy challenge, and the chances are he will say either Russia or China. He probably will not say the Arctic, yet the implications of what is happening in the Arctic will change patterns of international trade, drive food insecurity, deepen global poverty, increase refugee crises, reorient military alliances, and turbocharge military expenditures and the risk of the war. The 8 Arctic states, Canada, Finland, Denmark, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, the US, and Russia, have long collaborated on scientific research through the Arctic Council, a non-military body, until now. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Arctic Council meetings ceased. So did cooperation with Russia. This has hampered progress on climate and environmental research and turbocharged the militarization of the Arctic. I finished the quote. Arctic Council is an organization that does not include military affairs, and it has not expelled Russia. It has sort of suspended its activities, and there is a movement, and Martin will talk about it, to include somehow Russian scientists in the Arctic Council, because climate change and the environment do not know of borders and wars. On the other hand, and Martin will explain the security situation in the region and the impact of militarization of the region. The format today is rather simple. Martin will give a 30-minute presentation, and then it will be open for a live Q&A. Martin, thank you so much for joining us. And Martin had just admitted to us, it is not very often that he speaks to the European media and the south of Denmark. So welcome to Central Europe, Martin, and South Europe.
Thank you very much.
The screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and also for the kind introduction. I appreciate this opportunity very much, and welcome to everybody who's listening in. I look forward particularly to our dialogue and questions and answers, but I will give a brief introduction to my own observations. Basically, I'm a journalist, not a scientist. You all know what that means for the basis of my talk here. But let me jump right into it. I think that a lot of people have yet to understand the importance of the Arctic to the war in Ukraine and vice versa. There is an increased, very tangible militarization of the North Atlantic and the Arctic. And you will see that in particularly in Russia. That is what we talk about. That is what the media covers very intensively. Less tangible, but at least very, very notable, or as notable, is the increase in Western militarization of the North Atlantic and the Arctic as an answer, as a reply to the militarization of Russia's Western Arctic. But I think it's about time we get one of the maps that Mirjana was talking about. So if I could ask for the first map, please. You will have an impression of the Arctic region. It's not very often we look at the world in this fashion. Some of you will be familiar with the map, some of you not. But let me point a few items out for you here. The Arctic Ocean, of course, is still very icy. But the straits along the coastline of Russia and the straits north of Canada and Alaska are increasingly free of ice in the summer months, and traffic is increasing, in particularly along the northern shores of Russia. International traffic is very scarce, but a lot of Russian traffic is moving about in those parts in the summertime, and also increasingly in the wintertime. There's oil deliveries from the seas up there to the markets in Europe and elsewhere. And then militarization is very important to understand. This was one of the most militarized regions in the world during the Cold War. for the simple reason that we have to understand as a basis for this discussion is that if you look at it and imagine this is the top of a globe, we are still living on a round planet. So the shortest route from, let's say, northern Russia, the northwestern Russia to the US is in the Arctic. Also, notably, the northern parts of Russia, the northwestern parts down in the, say, the right-hand corner of this map is ice-free all year round because of the Gulf Stream that heats up the waters all the way to this northern part of Russia. So you can barely see it, but Murmansk, the largest town in the Arctic, the entire Arctic is Murmansk, down right there. Thank you very much for pointing that out. Down at the Kola Peninsula, the waters there are ice-free, which means that Russia has been able to, for many, many years, have a supremely important set of naval bases, housing submarines, naval ships, planes, etc. I'll get back to that. Look also, please, a little north of there into the ocean is a small set of islands called Franz Josef Land, which is part of Russia. On these islands, there is a small island called Nagorskaya, which is now home of a very, very sophisticated air base with a 3-kilometer runway that can house and service all sorts of Russian military airplanes, and is doing so as we speak. There are new facilities for several hundred of troops that can service the Air Force of Russia. And if you look at that map and imagine that the US is basically just around the corner, if you can talk of corners on a round globe, you will imagine that this is of increasing concern to a lot of people in the Western alliances. But just notice how large Russia is. Russia comprises half the Arctic. There is no way that the Arctic can function in future without Russia, but I'll come back to that and the Arctic Council, etc. But let's talk about security, and let me please have the next map, and we'll get a closer look at the Kola Peninsula. Here we go. You will see Murmansk right there, and Zapatnia Litsa, that's just one of the military bases along the coast of the Kola Peninsula. And you will imagine how close that is to Norway and Finland. The border to both are just about 100 kilometers away. You can go by bus from under normal circumstances. I've done it several times from Norway across the Kola Peninsula to Murmansk. People go there for shopping and vice versa in normal times. But the area is very heavily militarized, and the bases there are comprising, and now this is the key issue when we talk about the war in Ukraine and the frequent threats raised by Mr. Putin's regime of the use of nuclear armaments. Of course, this looks as if we're very far from Ukraine, but a lot of the planes that carry out bombing raids in Ukraine over Kiev and other cities and areas in Ukraine actually derive from the bases. They're based there. The number of planes that have moved to the air bases in the Kola Peninsula that are used for air raids into Ukraine are based up in the Arctic. It's not very far away. The Arctic is, the basis we're talking about here is no further from Moscow than Kiev is. So we're talking of relatively, let's say, not small, but not impossible distances for operations like that. Also, naval ships from the bases in the Arctic have been used extensively for carrying supplies to the Russian war efforts in Ukraine. They simply go out from the harbors close to Murmansk in the larger military complex called Severomorsk, and they travel along the coast of Norway, down along the European coast, into the Mediterranean, into the seas, and get closer to Ukraine, and they simply offload tanks, troops, armored vehicles, etc. So we frequently see large numbers of losses to Russian troops that are based otherwise in the bases, in the barracks up in Murmansk. So this, of course, changes the whole arithmetic. If the nuclear armaments that Russia is talking about, they are to a very large extent based on the Kola Peninsula. Here is some of the silos that actually contain the nuclear warheads. They're not used at the moment. I must stress that there is no sign that the nuclear warheads have been dug out of the silos in the Arctic, on the Kola Peninsula, but the capabilities to carry these warheads and actually apply them in a hostile manner are located to a very large degree on the bases we're talking of now. Naval ships, of airplanes, and in particularly interesting in this context, the very, very modern new generations of Russian submarines. These are key to the threats that are perceived by NATO and the US from the Russian Arctic. Not only in the Arctic, but certainly very much also when we're talking about the defense of Europe, should it come to that. Let us not hope that becomes relevant, but from a military perspective, from a strategic perspective, these are threats, obviously, that are taken very seriously at the moment. You should also note here, Sweden and Finland, of course, are now, Finland already, Sweden on the brink of becoming a NATO member. That also changes the whole arithmetic here. But I think the key issue here, let me have the next map, please.
Next map.
Is to understand what I've just said, that the shortest distance from these naval bases, these very large Russian capacities to launch nuclear armaments, is very close to the US. This changes the thinking in Washington. It has done so for a long time, but this has increased the intensity of the US efforts to counteract the threat in the Arctic, from the Arctic, has been very significant over the last couple of years, and in particular, of course, since February last year, the invasion of Ukraine. What we've seen over the last couple of years, 3-4 years, is a very, very intensive cooperation between the US, Great Britain, and Norway in particular. Norway, of course, because of its proximity to the nuclear bases that we're talking about on the Kola Peninsula. Put briefly, what the Allied forces are attempting is simply to create the capacity to destroy on a very immediate basis, the very bases in the Kola Peninsula, the Russian bases that I'm talking about. You will see a very large increase in US naval ships that have visited and are still visiting, basically on almost not on a constant basis, but they are very frequently now operating in the north. One of the largest carriers, aircraft carriers of the US Marine was recently in Oslo and continued off northwards along the northern coast of Norway, the western coast of Norway. There are surveillance flights from bases in the UK that go up along the Norwegian coast and down along the coast of Murmansk to monitor any type of military activity, any change in the normal patterns of the Russian Navy up there. On a very frequent basis. We know that from very easily approached sources. You have all the instruments on your telephone. You can follow these flights on Flight Tracker and so forth. The naval ships are easily detectable and so forth. Norway has increased its military capacity for one item in particular, which is of key concern also to the UK, which is the nuclear submarines of Russia. These are silent ships, very new and innovative modern submarines that are capable of carrying a large number of nuclear and conventional missiles. And they have a weak point north of Norway and north of the Kola Peninsula because the seas there are not very deep. They're quite shallow. I think, if I remember correctly, about 300 meters. Which makes them vulnerable for surveillance and destruction by foreign forces. For the period of time, I think it's about 20 hours, they need to travel from Severomorsk, from the bases along the coast of the Kola Peninsula, and into the deeper parts of the North Atlantic, of course, where they will be safer from detection and attack from the Western countries. So that is sort of this very simple way of explaining why the Arctic has suddenly increased significance from a purely strategic military point of view. This, of course, changes the politics and the approach to the war in Ukraine and to Russia by all the governments in the Arctic, including Norway in particular, which Norway is particularly concerned and also feels under pressure from, let's say, gray area disturbances caused by Russian sources. There are allegedly there are Russian attempts to hack the IT systems of the parliament and the administration in Oslo, etc., etc. So this is intensifying the political climate, and it's certainly intensifying what we see in military activity, exercises, etc. Finland and Sweden, as I said, joining the NATO alliance, of course, increases the pressure on Russia's military defense in that area. There are very, very substantial air defense machinery in place in and around the bases in Murmansk, also on the islands out in the Arctic Ocean, or in the Barents Sea, as we call it, closer to land. But let me have a next map. I'll rush through this so we can get to the dialogue. Just enable sort of a more marine approach to the threats here. If you look at it, we call it the Guyuk Straits. That's the waters between Greenland and Iceland and the UK. Greenland, Iceland, UK, Guyuk Straits. There are two straits in particular that are of military importance, that between Greenland and Iceland, and the waters between Iceland and the UK, where you can just barely see the Faroe Islands. And for some times, there has been a gap simply in the NATO countries' ability to monitor the skies, but now a NATO radar is planned and financed and will be erected not very long from now on the Faroe Islands, and so forth. The military capacities and exercises of the US in particular, but also the UK, Norway, and other countries in this part of Europe is very much on the increase. The US base in Keflavik in Iceland was closed in the middle of the last decade, but has now, it's not officially reopened as a US base, but the US military activity in Iceland has increased very, very significantly over the last years, in particular in an effort to monitor any Russian submarine traffic in the area. So that's, I've given you a very, very brief outline here. There's, of course, also very grave concern in the UK that Russian flights, Russian fighter jets or bombers might simply reach the UK or Western Europe without being detected, simply flying over the waters here, retanking in the air or whatever they need. So the monitoring, the situational awareness is very much on the governments and the military establishment minds these days in this part of the Arctic. So is there no communication? Is there no diplomatic efforts that we should look at? Yes, as Mirjana mentioned, the Arctic Council, which is the preeminent intergovernmental body in the Arctic, has been working efficiently since its establishment in 1996. Over a relatively short period of time, the Arctic Council has been established as the most important intergovernmental agency or collaboration body in the Arctic. It's a governmental body, as I said. It has a biannual ministerial meeting with the foreign ministers, etc. They do not talk about military affairs or security in the Arctic in the council. That was part of the agreement from the very beginning, that military affairs, security would be excluded from the deliberations in the council. But it has served as a meeting point and a venue where the governments would get together, also with very strong and committed Russian participation. The Russian Arctic is increasingly and very, very much important to the Kremlin for economic reasons. A very large percentage, I think it's about 20% of the value of Russian exports are now generated in the Arctic. There is room for expansion, there is room for investment, and it's also a very raw material rich, mineral rich, oil rich, gas rich part of Russia, which is attracting a lot of Chinese interest. And we're now getting closer to sort of the second layer of Western concerns, is that China has proven very, very interested in developments in the Arctic. There are no Chinese military presence in the Arctic, as far as we know. But from a diplomatic point of view, from an economic point of view, China is very, very much present in the Arctic nowadays. So that's a second layer that is of particular interest to some. In particularly, we have seen the US raising concerns over China's inroads into the Arctic. There is discussion of let's say, the calamities at hand here, but that's an added layer of significance to Arctic politics at the moment. The Arctic Council presently, as Mirjana said at the beginning, is at a pause, meaning that the Western countries, just after the invasion of Ukraine in February last year, decided to pause the Arctic Council, in particularly collaboration with Russia, which was simply put on a very brutal hold, meaning that all sorts of connections, scientific collaborations, environmental programs, educational programs, border crossing programs, etc., were all put at a hold. And this goes for basically all the Arctic countries. There is no formal collaboration. It also goes for the EU. All these types of collaborations with Russia were halted, and the Arctic Council basically came to a stop. It was a pause. It is not, the Arctic Council has not been dissolved. Russia is still a member, but there is no formal contacts. There are no meetings with Russia. Some of the programs, the scientific programs, which is really at the core of what the Arctic Council does, it's a huge set of environmental, climate science programs, etc. And also a lot of programs that aims to better the lives and increase growth and welfare in the Arctic countries for the indigenous peoples of the Arctic, which they all form an integral part of the Arctic Council. They have special status there. No decisions are basically made without the consent of the Arctic peoples within the Arctic Council. And then, of course, you can add several layers to the complexity here if you add climate change and the challenges that poses to the Arctic. Climate change is happening in the Arctic now. Some parts of the Arctic 3-4 times as fast as in the rest of the world. This is really, really a calamity that all who live in the Arctic or are concerned about developments in the Arctic are very, very conscious of. I was at the last summer, the very, very northern tip of Greenland, called Cap Moish-Jesup. This is the northernmost point of land in the world. And you can imagine the feeling that when we discovered that at midnight, it was 90 degrees Celsius, 19 degrees Celsius at midnight at the northernmost point in the world, a land point in the world. That is not how things used to be. The ice in the ocean in the Arctic is decreasing very rapidly, and all societies in the Arctic, including the Russian Arctic, are very badly hurt by the changes that are taking place to the physical basis for existence in those parts of the world. If you look at the permafrost thaw and the calamities, the damages that is causing to civil society in the Russian Arctic, it's quite amazing. This is not something that is being advertised very strongly. It is not something that Western media have had much focus on, but the civil structures, railroads, roads, any type of infrastructure you can think of, apartment buildings, etc., in the larger towns in northern Russia are very badly hurt. And the same goes for, of course, for Alaska, Canada, and parts of the European Arctic. So we're talking of very, very serious changes to the physical world in the Arctic that is affecting all sorts of significant structures and also policy domains in the countries we're talking about. So this is the underlying picture that we have to bring with us if we are to understand the security dimension in this part of the world. But I think I'll stop there. I'm sure that this will appear as a very, very superficial approach, but I've tried to give you just some headlines, and hopefully it will serve as an avenue to a discussion that we can have for the next half hour, I believe. Yes, Mirjana, I hope this helps a little, and I look forward to whatever comes my way.
Thank you so much, Martin. It is really the iceberg of the iceberg, the ice of the iceberg that you have told us. I asked the audience to raise their hands, and you can turn on their microphone while you're thinking of your question. I have several, and they refer to the environment. China is very interested in the Arctic, and from my understanding, even Japan, because they hope that by the year 2030, when in the summer there will be no more ice, they can shorten the route to Europe, or from Europe to Asia, by like 30%. So we are speaking also of the Northern Silk Road. I'm just wondering one thing: what will be the environmental consequences of that? That's one thing. Another thing, just give us. I have like three probably related, unrelated questions. We understand there is oil, there is gas, there are rare earths in the Arctic region, and rare earths are so important for green technology. Now, what is worse, to exploit these rare earths in the Arctic or not to exploit when it comes to the environment? And who really gives the permission to exploit or not exploit oil, gas? And the third, could you just say Norway is about to start deep sea mining at 4,000 meters in the sea. It's the first time, and from my very basic understanding, no one knows of the consequences. Can you just tell us a few words about that? And I invite the audience to ask questions. You can ask live, you can write in the chat, whatever you prefer.
Thank you. Let me start off with the shipping that is expected in the Arctic Ocean. Some of it is already happening. As I said, the traffic along the northern sea route north of Russia is already happening. Of course, the war is deterring some from using this route, Western countries. But there's a lot of Russian traffic, and it's increasing quite rapidly year to year. China's interest, Japan's interest, Korea, India, a lot of Asian countries are very interested in this route for two reasons. It will shorten the transport from, let's say, Japan or China, Korea to Europe with approximately 1/3. And if you look at the charts and what traffic in the seas are all about, it's about cutting costs and in particular cutting time at sea. So this is increasingly important for Asian countries. And also for China, this lessens the dependence on the straits down south of Asia, the Malacca Straits, etc., which are choke points also from a security point. So China is diversifying its access to oil, gas, and minerals, also from using the Northern Sea route. The usage so far is not very extensive, but there is increasing attention to this Northern Sea route. Whether this will be environmentally friendly or not depends on how you look at it. By shortening the route, they use less fuels, so less soot, less pollution, and less CO2. But of course, you are bringing traffic to a region that is otherwise not very much used for trafficking of this sort. So it depends on the eyes that are looking at it and whose side you are on. With the rare earth and other minerals and who gives permission to mine, well, the Arctic is like any other part of the world. There are borders that are internationally recognized that will tell you which part of the Arctic belongs to which nation. This is not different from any other part of the world, and the rights to the resources in the ground or at sea belong to the nation states like anywhere else in the world. So it's just because we're unused to looking at the Arctic as part of the mainstream political, economic, environmental, cultural traits in the world that we differ when we look at it and start imagining all sorts of things, that it's a free-for-all or anybody can go there and put a stick in the ground and say it's mine. That's not how it is, and hasn't been like that for 100 years. And then you ask Norway and deep sea mining. I'm certainly no expert, but it's obvious that Norway, with its immense wealth generated from oil and gas over the last decades, is interested in diversifying its source of income. And they have been using technology in very innovative ways in many fields, not only oil and gas, but they're also, as you say, looking at deep sea mining. The technology that they're developing is very, very sophisticated. And they're also looking at biological elements that are crucial for certain developments, foodstuff, medicines, etc., that might be derived from the Arctic seas. This has been ongoing for decades, and Norway is a leading enterpriser in this field.
Since no one is raising a question, I have another question. While in the rest of Europe, or in the EU rather, one is not talking. One talks about the war and militarization and what's after the war, but in the Arctic, one is talking also of decoupling war and scientific cooperation with Russia, because environment and climate change doesn't have any borders. Could you please explain a little bit about, I think even you yourself has written that it would be important to reestablish scientific cooperation with Russian scientists?
Well, I've certainly interviewed a number of climate scientists from around the Arctic, including Alaska, the US, and other countries that have been engaged in pan-Arctic climate science for many, many years. I think one conversation with a high-ranking official from one of the scientific working groups under the Arctic Council comes to mind. He was explaining to me how they have worked within the council's remit since 1996 on establishing, let's say, smoother collaborations with Russian scientists and scientific institutions. This has taken decades. There's great interest on both sides, but you can imagine scientific systems, language systems, etc., that has to be brought together across a fairly serious border lines, administrative issues, and also a certain amount of mistrust that was sort of carried over from the Soviet times. Now, after 2.5 decades of hard work, he said, all this was just about beginning to work as it should. Data was flowing, data was beginning to flow from one scientific system into the other, and then bang, the war in Ukraine stopped everything. And these collaborations, some of these are very vulnerable, some of them are quite fragile, and some Russian scientists, not to say quite a number, have become dependent on also financial flows from their collaborations in Europe and the US and Canada. So these collaborations are vital, or were vital to, let's say, all efforts to measure climate change biodiversity on a pan-Arctic scale, which really makes it important for the rest of the world, because that is how you really get to grips with what climate change is. Why is it happening so fast in the Arctic, and what can we expect from climate change in southern latitudes? So these collaborations basically stopped. I would not say they collapsed, because a lot of these are also built on friendships and let's say more personal contacts. But if they're not revived within a relatively short period of time, there is a danger that some of them will perish and not be reestablished anytime soon. And then I follow this quite closely. There is also others who follow this very closely. There is a EU-financed private network of climate stations, climate science stations, that used to include also Russian science stations. There's about 75 altogether. They meet once a year and they have talks, etc. And some of these people, of course, are very concerned. The network is called Interact, and they are also looking at how will we act when or if governments allow us to work with Russian scientists somehow again. Also within the Arctic Council, I'm sure, or I know that the diplomats are looking very, very carefully at what options do they have within the official circles of the governments of the Arctic for reopening opportunities for Western scientists and Russian scientists to work together. This is a very dangerous process. It could be a very dangerous process. The soil here is very, very fragile and muddy, you could say, in diplomatic terms, because there is a certain danger that Western colleagues would endanger their Russian colleagues if they try to involve them too quickly, too closely, too much within these scientific systems and collaborations. This might not be popular with the authorities in Russia and could endanger the individuals we're talking about in Russia. But there's no doubt that a lot of people are very concerned that the climate science that was ongoing and which is crucial for the global understanding of climate change has been pretty badly damaged by the understandable, I believe, break to political relations within the Arctic Council with Russia.
Thank you so much. Stephanie Hartner, please turn on your microphone and please introduce yourself. A microphone, unmute yourself.
Hello, good morning. Thank you very much for this interesting talk. My name is Stephanie Hart. I'm from the Heinrich Böll Foundation, and it's a branch in Vienna with the Dialogue Office for International Civil Society Cooperation. Since the Arctic is a formidable example for a global commons and has to be managed somehow, do you see any mechanism for, not for the near future? I'm pretty aware that this is not really, it doesn't give hope for soon solutions. But do you see any mechanisms that could be built up and established within an international system, which could also be used then for other global commons? I'm just thinking of space cooperation, whatever, because obviously the United Nations are insufficiently equipped to deal with these kind of matters. So based on your thorough analysis, do you have an idea how that could work in the near future? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'll take the second. Let's take the second question, and then you, Martin. Georg Karschenberg, please turn on your camera.
Yes. Thank you very much indeed. My camera is on. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, better visible. Well, I have a question about the Russian issue concerning the land structure, or the structure below the Arctic Sea, starting from some Siberian region, and they therefore claim the area all the way up to the North Pole, and how are the consequences economically and politically for this claim, because the borders are not quite clear yet. Thank you.
Thank you. Martin?
Yes, thank you very much, both. Very, very crucial questions. Stephanie, thank you for bringing up the question of and the terminology you used, the commons in the Arctic. This is a very long-standing discussion that goes back at least 2 decades, where a lot of people have been talking about the potential for an Arctic treaty, let's say a global Arctic treaty, where the world at large would have some say in the developments in the Arctic. And I think for a lot of people, the model that they have been looking at is the Antarctic Treaty, which of course has been working quite well since 1959, where a host of countries have agreed, let's say, to put it simply, on a environmentally very strict regime that has been operating in this Antarctic now for several decades, and quite successfully so. I know there are many problems involved in the Arctic Treaty and the management of the Antarctic continent, but it has served as a model for thinking about the Arctic. Could we apply a similarly cooperative global protection scheme for the Arctic or parts of the Arctic? Now, this has come, let me put it briefly, nowhere. For the reason that the Arctic countries, the governments of the US, Russia, Canada, the Scandinavian countries, have not shown any interest. They say the difference is that the Antarctic continent is a continent. We're talking about a landmass, whereas the Arctic is basically waters. We're talking of the Arctic Ocean, or perhaps also part of the Arctic landmass, which is of course already national countries, that are nation states that you cannot put under an international treaty. So if you're looking at an international system of governance or some sort of commons that would be regulated somehow on an international basis, that would include governments from outside the Arctic, this would not be favored by any of the Arctic governments. They are simply opposed to the idea, and they claim it's impossible to imagine a such system because it would violate their sovereign rights to the seas, the landmass, and also to the seabed in a substantial part of the Arctic Ocean. Greenpeace came some ways in raising public awareness of the idea about 10 years ago with an international campaign to protect parts of the Arctic Ocean, which is international waters. But again, that died. There is nobody who talks about it any longer. So not to say that it's not a good idea. I'm just saying that from experience and from the discussions that I have followed over the last decade or so, I would say this is still a non-starter. It doesn't go anywhere whenever anybody brings it up. And it does come up to the surface from scientists, from social scientists, politicians. It was a strong issue within the European Parliament about 10 years ago, but very, very rarely is it brought up by anybody close to any of the Arctic governments. I'm sorry if this is disappointing, but that's how I see it. And George, thank you very much for raising the issue of the seabed in the Arctic Ocean. This is a major issue, and it could, of course, potentially become contagious and let's say a source of conflict between Russia and the other interested parties in the Arctic. But let me say that we need to understand that on this particular issue, which is basically about drawing borders on the seabed, who owns which part of the minerals, the oil that might be found under the seabed in the Arctic Ocean, up around the North Pole. That issue, if you look at Russia's approach to this, Russia has followed every rule in the book, and the book is the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. There is very, very strict regulation on how the borders should be drawn, on the scientific basis for any claims made to the seabed up there. And there is a UN-based or US-founded commission of scientists, of specialists who deal with any claims up there. I'll not bore you with the details. It's hugely complicated. But basically, we have to acknowledge for the time being, Russia has followed for the last 20 years when this discussion has been ongoing. Every rule in the book, they have complied with all timelines, with all claims, all demands for scientific data. When they were told once, you have not submitted sufficient scientific data, they started over and came back with more scientific data, etc. So collaborations also with the other claimants, which is basically for the time being, primarily Canada and the Kingdom of Denmark with Greenland. The collaborations have not been easy, but they have not been, let's say, outside the book. Rules are being followed, agreements have been established that the issue of who owns what in the Arctic Ocean will be solved according to the rules of the United Nations. That said, just one more sentence on this. This is important that we should not sort of add this to the tension already brewing in the Arctic. I think this issue could, for now, be kept somewhat, let's say, off the grid of our discussion about security. But of course, it plays a role. Russia, last sentence, has claimed 75% of all the seabed in the Arctic Ocean, including the seabed at the North Pole, over the last 10, 15 years. And the claims are overlapping heavily with the claims of the Danish Kingdom, Greenland, Denmark, and the claims from Canada. So you have a humongously large, we're talking billions of square kilometers that are claimed by all three claimants, and you may have in the future also a US claim. So that's a complexity, but I warn you, this is not something that I would, let's say, put under very heavy conflict-prone headlines in the newspapers I work for.
Thank you, Martin. Michaela Pedek, the word is yours. Please introduce yourself. And then I'll ask Roman and also to introduce, and then please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Michaela. I'm a lecturer with the Catholic University in Eichstätt, Bavaria. And I'm a journalism lecturer and very interested in the field of the Arctic because we are doing a course on explanatory journalism on this field. So I would like to go back to the role of China. And I've read about the role of China, that they are claiming in international waters also because they are erecting some artificial islands or something like that. So do you have any further insights about the role of China and investing in the Arctic? As we know, China is investing everywhere in the world now, especially in Africa. But what are their goals in the Arctic?
Thank you so much, Michaela. Roman? Go ahead.
Good morning, and thank you very much, Mirjana, and thank you, Martin, for this fascinating presentation. Actually, my question follows from Michaela's because I'm also teaching journalism, but also writing for the media. And I wanted to ask you a question a little bit like meta for your experience as a journalist and as somebody who's communicating this to a global public. It's one of the difficulties of engaging with this story is that because it's not a sort of populated country as we know it, people find it harder to engage at the human level also. But I think for people who live in countries that are not part of the Arctic Council, maybe they feel a little bit sort of disenfranchised because there is no avenue for them to lobby or engage or put pressure. So I just wanted to, if you have any reflections about how it's, strategies of engaging audiences and sort of lay people with this beyond the geopolitics, if you like.
Thank you, Roman.
Thank you again for two crucial questions. We could talk for several hours on both of them, but let me try. Michaela Pedek, thank you very much for the China question. Let me start with the artificial islands. I've never heard of anything concerning artificial islands and China in the Arctic. I know in the South China Sea, of course, that is a huge issue. I have not heard of any artificial islands being built or erected or planned by China in the Arctic. Just that's my observation. But let me use a few words on China in the Arctic because it is very clear that China has a great interest in the Arctic. Climate change in the Arctic will change the ability of the Chinese authorities' ability to feed their population. The rising sea levels are currently pretty much influenced by the melting ice cap in Greenland. And of course, this is a huge concern to China and their millions of people who live in coastal cities in China. So there are a lot of reasons, simple reasons, why China is very interested in the Arctic. I've already mentioned also their interest in diversifying their access to oil, gas, and minerals for security reasons, because they don't want to be choked and only have one avenue of import of these crucial resources down south in the Malacca Strait and so forth. And then there are other more principal issues that China have raised very openly in their Arctic blueprints. One of them is that China is a member of the Security Council and claims a part of the responsibility to maintain the Arctic region as a peaceful region. China has been very eagerly pointing to a set of international conventions and agreements that also cover the Arctic, to which China is a very active partner. So I think, briefly said, China regards itself as a one of the world's global leaders, and as such, of course, the whole development of a region, China sees itself as a very natural member of and partner and actor within these developments. One should remember, perhaps, it's a nice way to remember what's happening in the Arctic, that for the first time in human history, a whole ocean that was closed is now opening for human traffic. And I don't often use this, and I apologize for the banality and the faults here, but if you imagine that the Mediterranean would only open in a year's time, imagine the dynamics that you would unleash. And the Arctic Ocean, not to compare them too closely, but it has some of the same dynamics. We are opening where the world is now watching an entire ocean opening for human traffic. This brings Asia closer to Europe and the US and vice versa. This raises new opportunities, new challenges for the continent that houses billions of people. So obviously this changes the global dynamic. And we have to look at it in that way if we want to understand also China's interest in the Arctic. They call themselves a near Arctic state, of course, to signify their own interest in the Arctic. This has been ridiculed by a lot of other states, in particularly the Arctic states, who are very keen to maintain their own, let's say, predominant role in this part of the world. Now to the question, Roman, of how other countries outside the Arctic may feel a little, I think you used the word disenfranchised, and I find that very interesting and very clever and precise. There is a lot of other countries, apart from the Arctic countries, who take an interest in the Arctic. China is just one of them. A number of countries are observers to the Arctic Council because they want to participate in the development of new regulation, new opportunities, and the science that is so important for understanding climate change and other factors that will impact the rest of the world. But the Arctic Council so far is fairly much a closed venue. And I say this reluctantly because there's a lot of nuance to it. But in principle, the only people who have the rights to speak at the ministerial meetings, for instance, is representatives of the indigenous peoples of the Arctic and the 8 governments. All the observer countries, which include a lot of European countries, China, Japan, Korea, etc., India, and the international organizations that also have observer status, do not have the right to speak at the ministerial meetings, which serves as an indicator. They can speak at other opportunities, but it serves as an indicator of the nature of the Arctic Council. It was derived and designed to, let's say, put the Arctic governments in a predominant role in the Arctic. As I said before, also when we talked about the commons in the Arctic, as some people like to call it, the Arctic governments are very aware of their territorial rights and privileges in the Arctic.
Thank you so much, Martin. This hour went by really fast. And as we promised, as I promised at the beginning, this is only the beginning. We do hope to, Daniela Kraus wrote to me, we have to do something in person. We promised to do something bigger because it's a huge topic. It's a very important topic. And it's important to know this topic out also in Central and South Europe, because with climate change, if nothing else, we shall all be directly affected. Thank you so much, Martin. Thank everybody. And I would just like to give a word to my two partners,
Mirjana,
Yes.
could I add just one word? I can't remember how to put up my hand on the screen, but sorry about interrupting you. I just wanted to say thank you for the attention of those who participated, and say that you're very welcome to write me. I think Mirjana has my email and is welcome to distribute it. I'd like to continue the conversation if there's any interest.
Thank you so much. Ivan, Daniela?
Well, thank you very much to Martin and Mirjana. I think if some of us were not aware of the importance of the Arctic for global well-being of this planet and of humankind, for peace and security in the world, and for health and actually survival, then this was a real wake-up call. So I look forward to future events, and thank you.
Thank you. Daniela?
It was just left to say thank you, Martin. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mirjana. Thank you, Ivan.
This is the beginning and we shall continue. Thank you. Well.
That was great.
Good.
Oh, are we still on? Sorry, I turned off my camera.